when you worked in Japan, you worked with the first one was Fujiwara. Karl Gotch, I believe, trained Fujiwara. Did you ever know Karl Gotch?
I did. He used to come in there, and him and Fujiwara used to sit in the office while we were out there training and stuff, and they would just drink bottles and bottles of wine and or whatever else they drank. And he used to have some fun in there. But where you got kind of humbled was when they'd be in there, they would be drinking, and then one time Karl came out and lined everybody up, and we had a circle. And there was probably, I don't know, 15 of us. And so Karl put a deck of cards. It was 2 decks of cards. And he would flip it over. And he told us, hearts, you do push-ups. Spades, you do squats. This, you do this. This, you do diamond push-ups. And so all the cards meant something. And each of them were what the card said. If it was an ace, you would do 50. If it was a joker, you'd do 100. If it was a king, queen, or jack, you would do 10. And if it was a 10, you do 10. And anything else was 9, 8, 7, whatever it was, you do that number. And you would go through the whole deck. And we went through it was 2 decks. We ended up getting through the first time through, which was the 2 decks. And it had to be in at least around 1,000 or so of these different things that we had done. And there was probably 4 of us left. Funaki was one of them. And I think Suzuki was another. And then all the Americans except myself were gone after the half of the deck. And then there was a few young boys because they're always working. I think there was 2 different young boys, and they probably could have went longer too, but they dropped off because they didn't want to be beating their guys because they would get beat up. So a lot of the young boys would just drop out on purpose because they didn't want to outshine anybody. And then when it came right down to it, it was me and Karl Gotch that was left. I mean, I literally went through the whole deck. I think it was almost 2 times, both those decks. Karl Gotch was still there after that. It was me and Karl, and he would have kept going. I mean, he would have kept going. And he was in his late 60s or 70s then. And he was back there drinking and having fun. He just thought he'd come out and train with us. And I was, at that point, that's when you looked at it and you knew this guy, boy, I tell you what, if he was 20 years younger, man, he'd be stretching all of us. I mean, just an amazing individual.
Karl lived right down the road from me, probably about 3 or 4 miles down the road. And I knew his next door neighbor. And one day I ran to his neighbor at the grocery store. He said, you know my neighbor, Karl Gotch, don't you? And I said, yeah, I know him very well. He said, can I ask you a personal question? I'm thinking, what Karl do? Threatening to kill him. He said, what the hell is he doing with all those Japanese boys in his garage? He said, at nighttime, my wife and I hear some of the strangest noise coming out of there and some of the most blood-curdling screams coming out of that thing. Yeah. I just looked at him. I said, you don't really want to know what he's doing. I said, he's torturing them, but he's physically torturing them. And I used the analogy that you just went through with the deck of cards. I said, he'll take a deck of cards to these kids. He'll turn them over. Went through the whole. He did. Holy cow! He said those kids are screaming every night.
He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't ask anybody to do anything that he hadn't already done.
Right. I took him one time. I called him. I said, Karl. I said, I was volunteer coach down at the high school. I said, would you come down and work out with my high school kids? He said, I don't. First thing out of his mind, he said, I'll be glad to do it. But he said, but I don't put up with any bullshit. He said, I said, Karl, I've warned these guys just to do what you tell them to do. He come down there, he had a workout, and he worked the guys. We thought we worked out these guys hard, but they were exhausted. The next day, every one of them come in, Mr. Brisco, would you bring back Mr. Gotch? We learned so much from him. He was such a good teacher that a lot of people just say Karl Gotch and you get turned off by the name, but this was a human being that cared for people. He cared for these young men. He took his time to break them down. He didn't torture anybody. He just put them through a workout that, a 65-year-old man could do, These are teenagers, and they loved him, man. I took him back down there a couple of times, and the kids just loved him, man, just being around something like that.
Yeah, Karl, like I said, when he didn't put up with any BS. I mean, like, he was one of those kind of guys that was just focused on what was real, and anything that wasn't, he wanted anything to do with you. And that rubbed a lot of people wrong, but it built champions. I mean, he knew how to put somebody that had ability and that could be a champion. He would get you there. But he wasn't going to put up with anybody's BS. If they didn't want to work, then he didn't want anything to do with them. He didn't have time for them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And speaking of guys like him, did you ever have the opportunity to be around Billy Robinson much and get on the mats with him or anything?
I didn't. No.
Billy was in the same mold as Karl. I mean, just an outstanding person, but he would push it to your limit. And you appreciated being around guys like that. You know, if you're competitive, you're an athlete, you want somebody like that. And every time you step in the ring with Billy, you know that he was going to push you to your limits there. And you always appreciated it.
Well, anybody that wants to be a champion or has high goals set for themselves, understand that you got to have somebody around you that's going to push you past what you want to do. And so many of these coaches nowadays, they get some of these talented guys and they don't want to piss them off because they're afraid they might lose them. But old school, man, it was like, listen, I can get you where you want to go, but I'm not going to be playing any BS with you. We're going to do it my way or go find somebody else.
Yeah, that's true.
Gary, was Karl, I always heard that Karl was the best shooter of his generation. Was that what you would agree with?
I agree if you don't put Billy in that same generation. I don't think you would, but I think Karl during that generation, if you include the Thez, everybody talked about Thez and everything. I have a ton of respect for Thez, but I really don't think in a shoot that Thez could have lasted very long with Gotch, because Gotch had a different mentality. I mean, he's got that Ken Shamrock mentality, or Ken Shamrock had that Karl Gotch type of mentality, where I'll hurt you. I'll break a bone. I'll hurt you before I'll let you beat me. And that's a mentality that you're not born with. It's a mentality that you develop, and he developed it just like Kenny has. And I Kenny will agree to me. It takes a certain mindset to want to go in there and hurt somebody and punch somebody in the nose, and not feel bad about it, But Gotch, I think Gotch, and I think that's what held Gotch back, just like it kind of held Hodge back, because Hodge, Kenny hit on it in the very beginning of this podcast, how hard that he worked not to hurt anybody, not to take advantage of anybody, but because one time you do that, and it's like you do it a million times. Yeah. Everybody in the world hears about it, and they get scared of it, and they don't want to work with it. The promoters don't want to put you in a spot to make money with it. So Kenny hit it right on the nail. He worked so hard in the beginning just to show people that he could work, that he could entertain, and he didn't have to hurt you to get over. And I think that's what hurt Gotch and guys like Hodge, because they just didn't trust him because of their mindset. And there wasn't a big platform where they could prove to it that they weren't that type of guys. They wanted to make money. And sometimes you wondered if Gotch really wanted to make money or make a name for himself. And I love Karl to death because he was a neighbor. But yeah, it was tough. But I think Karl was probably one of the toughest of his generation, if not the toughest.